When I moved back into my parents' home, it was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to rebuild, save money, and catch my breath after life took a sharp turn I wasn't prepared for. Their place looked peaceful from the outside. A neat lawn, steady porch light, familiar walls that once meant safety. But the calm was a surface, nothing more. Inside, the air carried expectations I didn't agree to, demands woven into daily routines, and a level of control that didn't look like help once I was old enough to recognize its weight. There were no slammed doors, no broken plates, no shouting matches that could be captured in a single dramatic moment. The tension was quieter, steadier, arriving in questions meant to corner, in rules presented as concern, in house traditions that had nothing to do with love. And every time I tried to set a boundary, the floor shifted beneath me, as if the house itself resisted the idea that I could stand on my own terms. What no one saw were the nights I sat awake replaying conversations, the hours spent wondering if I was the one overreacting, or the slow tightening in my chest every time a voice rose from downstairs. Living there meant learning that emotional pressure can be as heavy as any locked door, and just as suffocating. But this is not a story about breaking. This is a story about clarity, about finding the strength to name the truth, and about choosing to walk out of a house that didn't know how to hold me anymore. If you want more stories like this, raw, honest, and real, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I was 25 when I moved back into the upstairs room I used to nap in as a kid. Now it felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward when I wasn't looking. Losing my job had drained my account faster than I expected, so I stayed. Temporarily, I told myself, while I applied anywhere that still bothered to list openings. I tried to keep it clinical. A spreadsheet of expenses, a timeline, a color-coded chart of interviews that kept getting rescheduled. Still, there was something humiliating in hearing the faint echo of my own footsteps upstairs, like I had turned into a guest in the house that once smelled like my homework and my mother's detergent. I folded laundry at the foot of the bed, counted what I had left in my wallet, and practiced breathing in sets of 4. The air was warm from the hallway light. It buzzed, flickered, then steadied. Almost like it was reminding me I didn't control much in this place anymore. The first morning, the chores list wasn't a list, it was a tone. My mother didn't hand me anything. She just looked at the dishes in the sink and said, "Since you're staying rent-free, make yourself useful." The phrase sat between us like a dropped fork. My father followed with instructions about taking out trash, wiping down the porch railing, sweeping the back steps. Tasks delivered as if I'd signed a hidden contract. I nodded, steady, clinical, because arguing this early would only feed whatever story they'd been writing about me since I moved back. Still, as I rinsed cups neither of them used, I felt the quiet sting of being managed rather than welcomed. I told myself to breathe, to observe, to record what mattered, not because I planned anything, but because clarity was the only power I had left. The hallway light flickered again, a faint electric pulse that matched the tightening in my chest. That afternoon I slid a small recording device between 2 books on the shelf above my desk. My fingers hesitated on the button, not out of guilt, but out of the strange grief that comes from documenting your own home. The machine made a soft whirring click as it started. I kept my expression neutral the way a clinician would before beginning a session. If I was going to survive the weeks ahead, I needed accuracy, not emotion. The hallway light hummed faintly through the door. Downstairs cabinet doors closed harder than necessary, each sound rising through the floorboards. I adjusted the recorder, angling its small red dot toward the doorway. The device didn't judge, didn't interrupt, didn't twist my words. It captured what was said and what wasn't, an impartial witness in a house where impartiality had quietly disappeared. I pressed the spine of the book back into place, covering the recorder without hiding it from myself. That evening, my father knocked once before pushing the door fully open. "Electric bill's gone up," he said. No greeting, no softening. You're using more than you think. I looked up from my laptop. I thought, this was home, I answered, careful, measured. One breath above monotone. His jaw tightened. He didn't shout, but the disappointment in his silence was loud enough to bruise. When he left, I unplugged my charger, coiled the cord, shut my laptop, and closed the recording device into my palm. The gesture was quiet but decisive. Maybe I needed someone who knew how to label this kind of environment, not as family conflict, but as something with definitions, patterns, terms. I put the recorder back on the shelf, pressed the button once, and let the hallway light's dim glow fall across the desk like a thin line dividing before and after. Later, I opened a new folder on my laptop and titled it Home_Proof. The cursor blinked, waiting, and I filled the space with small files. Timestamps, short notes, a few clipped audio segments. It wasn't about catching anyone. I wasn't hunting. I was building clarity in a place where conversations changed shape by morning.
Naming each file with the exact date and time felt strangely grounding. It turned vague discomfort into something I could hold up to the light, examine, and eventually understand. My hands were steady as I typed, though a part of me hated that I needed documentation in the first place. I closed the folder and sat back. The house creaked the way old houses do, wood settling under the weight of memory. My breath fogged faintly in the cool air from the window, and I let the quiet sit with me. Not peaceful, but honest. A thin metallic tatch, tatch, tatch echoed from the shelf, the recorder capturing some distant noise I couldn't place. Then silence. A complete, sudden silence that seemed to press against the walls. I looked toward the door. Nothing moved. The hallway light buzzed once before going still again. In that stillness, I felt the first clean edge of a truth I hadn't been ready to admit. This wasn't a temporary stay. This was the beginning of something I needed to name, track, and eventually walk out of. The recorder's red light dimmed to a single steady pulse, waiting for the next sound to break the quiet. By the end of the week, the list of small favors had grown into a rotating schedule that read more like a shift assignment than a household routine. The expectations were presented casually. Wipe the counter when you're done. Take out the recycling before bed. Rinse the patio tiles on Sunday morning. But each instruction came with a tone that suggested I was already late. I started keeping a checklist on my phone, not for them, but for myself. Date, time, who said what was asked. The act of documenting steadied something inside me. When the demands stacked too high, the record helped me remember I wasn't imagining the pressure. The house felt different now. Even the air in the hallway seemed to tighten around each new request, as if the walls were listening. I crossed off each task silently, moving through the house with measured steps, Careful not to scrape a chair or make a sound that could be interpreted as resistance.
One afternoon, as I reached for a glass of water, my mother glanced at me with a look that held more weight than the words that followed. "Some people," she said, her voice soft but edged, "don't realize how much they take." She didn't have to finish the sentence. I understood exactly where she was aiming it. I watched her wipe the counter already clean, the motion slow and deliberate, as though the gesture itself was a reminder of who carried the burden here. Something about the moment lodged in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a quiet ache that settled low and heavy. I stared at the digital clock on the stove. Then I wrote down the sentence word for word in my notes. It wasn't pettiness, it was self-preservation. A record of the way her language curled, the way implication replaced honesty, the way I'd begun to shrink my breath to fit the space left for me. Still, I tried to meet them halfway. I cleaned the kitchen early that evening, stacking dishes neatly, wiping the stovetop until it reflected the overhead light. When my mother walked in and raised her voice about a single plate left to dry, something inside me stopped bending. "I've finished my part," I said quietly, my tone steady, my posture still. She paused, surprised. Not because the words were rude, they weren't, but because I didn't fold the way I usually did. The moment stretched between us like a taut thread. The refrigerator hummed softly, filling the silence. I went back upstairs without adding anything else, reminding myself that clarity didn't need volume. My palms felt warm, not from fear, but from holding ground in a way that didn't escalate. I recorded the time later, noting only the facts, what was done, what was said, and what I refused to absorb. My father took a different approach. He didn't criticize the chores, he focused on logistics. "Lights off by 10, he said one night, standing at the bottom of the stairs as though guarding the threshold. "Electricity isn't free." The implication landed with the same force as a scolding, even if his tone stayed level. I stood halfway down the staircase, hands on the rail, and let the moment settle before responding. "I'm careful," I said. "I track my usage." He frowned, as if the idea of me monitoring anything felt like an overstep. Later, I photographed the utility meter numbers, aligning them with my time at home. Documentation was no longer a habit, it was an anchor. The soft click of the camera sounded sharp in the quiet hallway. I saved the photo, dated it, and breathed slowly until my chest stopped tightening. It became clear that what I wanted, unconditional warmth, wouldn't emerge just because I lived upstairs. Wanting it didn't make me entitled to it, but it didn't make their demands reasonable either. I had to choose which truth to hold. I chose the one measurable by behavior, not hope. I wrote a short line in my journal. "I can love them and still decline their terms." Seeing it written down steadied my breathing. I read it twice, then closed the notebook. The night air was cool against my arms as I stood by the window, listening to the murmur of distant traffic. I didn't need to win anything, I needed clarity. And the more I stepped back, the more the house's rhythms revealed themselves. Every shift in tone, every tightened expression, every rule disguised as helpful advice. By the end of the night, I had labeled the day's files, 027 a.m., 028 p.m., each one clean and orderly. I adjusted the gain on the recorder to pick up normal conversation, not whispers or dramatics. Precision mattered. I set it gently at the corner of the desk, not hidden, not displayed, just present. The upstairs room hummed with the soft vibration of the AC, a background steadiness that kept me grounded. I lay back on the bed, listening to the quiet layers of the house, faint footsteps below, the creak of a settling beam, the rhythmic pulse of something old but familiar. It wasn't peace, but it wasn't chaos either. It was data. And for the first time since moving back, that gave me something close to control. I decided to try something simple. A conversation shaped like a negotiation, not a plea. One afternoon, when the house felt relatively steady, I printed a one-page outline, 3 bullet points, nothing emotional. Clear schedule, respect for privacy, predictable boundaries. I placed it on the dining table where the late sun always fell in a quiet line across the wood. "I'd like us to agree on a routine," I said. My voice didn't shake, though a part of me expected it to. My mother glanced at the page the way someone glances at a pamphlet handed out on the street. Polite curiosity hiding a quick dismissal. I explained each point plainly, keeping my tone even. The refrigerator clicked on behind me, a low, steady sound that grounded me. I wasn't demanding. I wasn't accusing. I was asking for structure, in a house that shifted its rules as easily as wind moves a curtain. My mother didn't sit down. She brushed her hand once across the table and said, "This house runs the way I decide." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The line closed the door on any sense of collaboration. I watched her fold a dish towel as though the conversation had already ended. A small sting tightened under my ribs, that familiar blend of disappointment and confusion I kept mistaking for loyalty. I picked up the page without comment. There was no point in leaving it there like debris. She walked away humming softly, a sound that should have been comforting, but only made the air feel thinner. I didn't write down her exact words until later. I needed a little space between the moment and the record, a breath to let the truth settle into something I could see clearly. The next morning, I posted a brief note on the fridge, a schedule adjustment for the backyard chores. Nothing dramatic, just a shift to weekends, which made sense for someone juggling interviews and part-time shifts. I told them about it before leaving for the library. My tone was steady, careful. I wasn't claiming independence, I was asserting logistics. When I came home that evening, my father mentioned an additional errand, grocery shopping for the week. "I can't today," I said. "I have a job interview." The sentence felt strangely adult in my mouth, as if I was reminding both of us who I actually was. He didn't argue, but the silence afterward carried a faint disappointment that brushed past me like a cold draft. I noted the time in my phone, not to weaponize it later but to remind myself that boundaries didn't require permission to exist. The following day, my father tried again. "You could pick up produce tomorrow," he said, his voice mild but his expectation firm. I kept my hands loosely at my sides and answered, "I already have a commitment." It wasn't defiant, it was fact. His eyebrows tightened a fraction, the only sign that the old pattern wasn't falling neatly back into place. We stood in the hallway for a few seconds, the narrow space amplifying every quiet breath. A beam of light from the kitchen stretched across the floor, thin and pale. I stepped around it and returned to my room without raising my voice or offering an apology that wasn't owed. Later that night, I logged the exchange in my notes, keeping the language simple. No commentary, just timestamps and descriptions. Clarity wasn't coldness, clarity was survival. I spent that evening reminding myself that understanding wasn't a requirement for change. My parents didn't have to agree with my boundaries for me to maintain them. I wrote one line at the top of my journal page. "A boundary is a behavior, not a discussion." It felt steadier than the let's talk approach I had clung to for years. I closed the journal and sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the low hum of traffic outside the window. Somewhere downstairs, a drawer slammed. Louder than necessary, but not loud enough to pull me out of myself. Their reactions weren't my responsibility. My reactions were. I inhaled slowly, exhaled slower. A catalog of small truths was forming inside me, and each one made the room feel a little more mine. That night, a cabinet door clattered shut in the kitchen. The sound traveled through the house, sharp but distant, landing squarely in the recorder's memory as I adjusted its placement on my desk. I nudged it a little farther from the edge to avoid being obvious, but I didn't hide it. The tiny device blinked a soft red heartbeat in the dim room. I lay back and watched the ceiling for a moment, letting my breath settle into an even rhythm. Outside, a car rolled slowly down the street, tires whispering over asphalt. The house exhaled a long wooden creak. I pressed save on the day's notes. Nothing dramatic had happened, but something had shifted. I wasn't trying to win them anymore. I was learning how to stay standing. The escalation didn't arrive with shouting. It came in the form of a question, asked too casually over breakfast. "Since you're staying upstairs, we'll need a small utility fee." My mother said it without looking at me, as if the number existed somewhere between the coffee mug and the cutting board. I set my spoon down, steadying my breath. "Is there a lease?" I asked. Not sarcastic, not defensive. She blinked, surprised, then frowned as though I'd interrupted a script. I repeated the question with the same clinical tone someone might use at a clerical desk. She didn't answer. The silence stretched thin. I felt it settle into my shoulders, like a reminder. Expectations were shifting again. Not based on agreement, but convenience. I stood, rinsed my bowl, and walked away, with the kind of calm that made my spine feel unfamiliar. Upstairs, the air was cooler, Clearer. I wrote the exchange down as if preparing a quote from a meeting. The next attempt came wrapped in the same logic. "This is how the house works," my mother said when I asked if any of the rules were written down. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, posture relaxed but tone decisive. "We've always done it this way." She spoke as though I had arrived as a tenant rather than a daughter. "Is there documentation for the fees?" I asked. She exhaled sharply, not quite a sigh, more like irritation dressed up as authority. "We don't need paperwork, it's our home." There it was again, the shift from family to hierarchy, from care to command. I watched the steam rise from her tea, curling into the overhead light. Something inside me settled into a quiet certainty. Without clarity, everything becomes permission for whatever they needed from me that day. I texted later, asking for a specific time to discuss expectations. Not a confrontation, just a scheduled conversation. The message was concise and neutral. "Can we talk this weekend? I'd like to clarify routine and responsibilities." I stared at the screen for a moment before hitting send. It felt like offering a formal meeting request at a workplace, each word chosen to avoid emotional landmines. Hours passed before a reply came. A long series of complaints about my tone, my timing, my audacity to suggest terms. No agreement to meet. No acknowledgement of the actual question, just a long, winding reprimand. I saved the message, labeling it with the date, then I placed the phone face down on the desk, the soft thud feeling strangely decisive. Conversation, it seemed, wasn't a path. They wanted monologue. When I walked downstairs to grab water later that night, both of them were waiting in the living room. Or maybe it only felt that way because their voices carried up the staircase the moment they heard me. "We don't need a meeting," my father said. "We need cooperation," my mother added. "You've been difficult lately." The recorder in my pocket was already running, its quiet hum steady against my palm. I stood still, just far enough from them to keep the air from tightening. They spoke over each other, looping through the same lines, building a wall of sound that pressed into my chest. I didn't argue. I simply listened until the cadence revealed itself. Accusation disguised as concern. Control disguised as order. When they paused, I nodded once and stepped back upstairs. The stairs creaked beneath me, each descent of weight oddly grounding. I sat at my desk afterward and opened a blank document. There was nothing emotional in what I typed, just facts. The date, the request I made, the response I received, and the length of the exchange. I kept the sentences short, sharp enough to fit inside a column. It didn't feel like building a case, it felt like building clarity, in a place where clarity had been replaced with improvisation. The room was dim except for the desk lamp, which cast a pale circle across the keyboard. My fingers moved steadily, not rushing, not delaying. I read the notes twice, then saved them in the same folder. The act of naming a file had become a form of reclaiming space, one line of text at a time. Later that night as I was brushing my teeth, the kitchen lights blinked once, bright, then dim, then steady again. A metal ladle slipped from the drying rack and clattered into the sink downstairs. The sound echoed just long enough to feel like punctuation. I held the banister on my way back to the room, letting the cool wood settle my pulse. No confrontation, no retaliation, just a shift in the house's atmosphere. Small, perceptible, and unmistakably real. I closed my door gently, as if protecting something fragile inside me. The recorder blinked softly on my desk, capturing the quiet that followed. I built a table on my laptop the way someone might assemble a map before entering unfamiliar terrain. 4 columns. Time, words spoken. Request made, any witness present. The structure steadied my thoughts. I filled in the first row with the breakfast conversation about fees, the next with the late-night exchange in the living room. Each entry felt like placing a pin on a quiet internal blueprint. As I typed, the room carried the faint smell of detergent from the laundry downstairs. The light from my desk lamp drew a soft square across the floorboards. Nothing about this felt dramatic. It was practical, methodical. My way of refusing to let shifting narratives decide what was real. When I finished the table, I saved the file and watched the progress bar slide to completion. The folder was becoming a small archive, a steady counterbalance to the instability humming beneath the house's routines. I copied each file to a small USB drive I'd labeled by hand earlier that morning. The sticker felt slightly uneven under my thumb. Home-proof backup, printed in black ink. I placed the drive inside a plain envelope and tucked it into the pocket of my backpack, the one I carried everywhere. It wasn't paranoia, it was redundancy. Houses like ours had short memories and long histories of rewrites. I wanted something that couldn't be erased by a sudden shift in tone or a moment of selective recollection. As I zipped the bag, I could hear faint footsteps in the kitchen below, slow and deliberate. I paused, listening to the rhythm, then closed the zipper fully. The envelope pressed lightly against the fabric, a small, steady weight that reminded me I wasn't imagining any of this. I had records, not interpretations. That evening, as the sun set in a thin red line across the blinds, I stood in the hallway and spoke a single sentence before beginning the chores I had agreed to. I will do the tasks we discussed. My tone was level, bordering on neutral. My mother glanced up from the sink, a flash of irritation crossing her face before she returned to rinsing plates. She didn't acknowledge the sentence, but she didn't contradict it either. The faucet ran in a long, steady stream, the sound filling the kitchen like a continuous thread. I wiped the counter, stacked the clean bowls, and stepped back with deliberate calm. It wasn't about making a point. It was about consistency, building the habit of speaking in terms of agreement rather than obligation. Upstairs, I wrote the timestamp and the exact wording before the details could blur. Later that night, I heard laughter drifting up the stairs, sharp, familiar laughter that used to feel warm. Now it sounded brittle, carrying a note of mockery I couldn't quite ignore. "A contract," my mother said, loudly enough for her voice to carry. "Imagine needing a contract with your own parents." My father chuckled, and the sound hit me like a quiet, well-aimed tap on a bruise. I stayed still, hand on the doorknob, reminding myself not to react. Instead, I returned to my desk and added another line to the table. Tone used, language minimizing, implied ridicule. It wasn't vengeance. It was accuracy. The words they tossed around so carelessly had weight, whether they acknowledged it or not. I typed slowly, breathing evenly, choosing language that reflected the facts, not the hurt. If anything, the documenting sharpened a different truth. Affection and accountability often battled for the same space, and I could hold both without collapsing under the contradiction. I wrote a short note to myself on a sticky pad. Family doesn't erase responsibility. I placed it on the corner of my monitor, a small reminder that clarity didn't mean estrangement. It meant honesty. That night, I closed my door gently, turning the handle slowly so it wouldn't click too loudly. The house was dim, the air slightly cooler. I could hear the distant hum of the water heater through the wall. I sat on my bed for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around me like a thin blanket. I wasn't scared. I wasn't angry. I was awake to the patterns. Before going to sleep, I adjusted the knob on my recorder to reduce background hiss. The small device clicked faintly in my hand, a soft mechanical sound that steadied my breath. I placed it on the far side of the desk, angled so it captured conversation without distorting. My room felt organized in a way the rest of the house didn't. Shelves neat, papers aligned, a small island of order in a shifting landscape. I lay down, listening to the low hum of nighttime settling around the walls. The ceiling fan turned slowly, moving the air in a soft spiral. My last thought before sleep was simple. Clarity wasn't coldness. It was protection. Quiet, methodical, and entirely mine to maintain. The next morning began with another request disguised as an expectation. "You need to clear the yard before noon," my father said as he passed by my door. His tone was calm, but the wording landed like an assignment. I stepped into the hallway, still holding my mug. "I'm busy until the evening. I'll take care of it after 6, I said. The sentence was measured, almost quiet, but it stood its ground. He paused, considering whether to challenge me, then simply nodded, more out of habit than agreement. I went back inside and logged the exchange with the same meticulousness I'd grown into these past weeks. The light filtering through the blinds created thin slashes across the floor, and the warmth of the ceramic cup steadied my hand. I wasn't resisting, I was clarifying. There was a difference, even if no one else saw it yet. Arguments no longer erupted like storms. They arrived in small, sharp gusts. A comment tossed over a shoulder, an accusation shaped like concern, a sigh too pointed to ignore. I learned not to meet them where they started. When my mother snapped, "You think the world revolves around your schedule?" I simply looked at the clock, took note of the time, and kept walking. I didn't answer her in the hallway or the kitchen or the living room. Not because I was afraid, but because I'd learned the cost of responding in shared spaces. The stairs became a kind of boundary line. Above them, my voice stayed calm. Below them, I saved my breath. That evening, as I recorded the details, I found myself writing with a steadier hand than before. Silence was no longer avoidance, it was intentional restraint. I also started wearing headphones while I cooked, a soft instrumental playlist that covered the edges of any tone rising behind me. It wasn't about shutting them out. It was about keeping myself from reacting to things that didn't need responses. I stirred vegetables in a pan while the quiet notes shielded my heartbeat from the corridor of sound behind me. The recorder sat on a higher shelf, picking up the natural room noise without capturing every scrape of metal. My mother walked in abruptly, saw the headphones, and frowned, as if I'd broken an unspoken rule. I nodded politely, removed one air cup, and continued cooking without altering my pace. She waited for an argument that never arrived. When she left, the room felt lighter, as though my silence had absorbed the impact instead of amplifying it. Later that week, I installed a small lock on my desk drawer, not hidden, just there. A simple latch with 2 screws, the kind you find at a hardware store. I told them before doing it. "I'm adding a lock for personal items," I said. My father raised an eyebrow, my mother paused mid-step, but neither objected out loud. The drawer closed with a clean, firm click. I placed a few essentials inside: notebook, receipts, the printout of my job schedule. Not secrets, just boundaries made physical. The air felt cooler as I stood up. A moment later, I typed a short email to myself summarizing the modification, then archived it with the rest. The house had its own rules, and now, quietly, so did I. As days passed, I understood something I hadn't before. Restraint could be evidence, too. Not every instance of tension needed a verbal pushback. Sometimes, the absence of chaos held more power than any argument I could make. I wrote brief entries each night, 2 or 3 lines at most, describing only actions, not interpretations. I didn't raise my voice. No escalation. Stayed in my room during conflict. The simplicity of those notes grounded me. They reminded me that I wasn't adding fuel to anything. I was stepping aside from the old dance. The house made its usual nighttime sounds: pipes settling, wind brushing the siding, a faint creak in the hallway. And none of it shook me. I was learning to separate noise from danger, irritation from harm. The washing machine clicked through its final cycle late that night, a soft mechanical rhythm echoing through the vents. I lay in bed listening to the slow, uneven thud of its spin, a reminder of how ordinary life could coexist with tension without dissolving into chaos. I placed my phone face down and let the darkness of the room settle. The recorder captured the ambient sounds: water draining, distant footsteps, the hum of an appliance shutting off. My breathing stayed even, unhurried. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I was watching myself do it. And in the quiet of my small upstairs room, that shift felt like the first true sign of stability I'd had in a long time. By the end of the week, I gathered 7 days' worth of recordings. Nothing dramatic, just small instances of raised voices, shifts in tone, and comments that carried their own weight even if spoken casually. I listened through each file with headphones on, marking the moments where the cadence turned sharp or the volume spiked. The process wasn't emotional. It felt like reviewing case notes, distilling each interaction into its essential elements. I trimmed a few clips to remove irrelevant noise, leaving only clear samples of behavior. When I finished, the folder contained a series of concise files labeled by date and time. The act of organizing them softened something inside me, as if turning the chaos into a sequence of audio lines gave me a way to breathe again. I leaned back in my chair, letting the last file finish its quiet playback. I looked up local legal aid resources that night, places offering guidance, not confrontation. A clinic nearby provided brief consultations. Their website used neutral language, outlining support for housing disputes and unhealthy domestic dynamics. I wrote down the address in a small notebook, the paper grain catching slightly under the pen. The idea of speaking to someone who understood these patterns felt both foreign and necessary. I wasn't planning a battle. I was seeking clarity from someone trained to name things I couldn't yet articulate. Outside my window, a car passed slowly, casting shifting light onto my desk. I bookmarked the clinic's page and closed my laptop, allowing the room to return to its usual quiet hum. The next morning, I drafted a short email to the clinic, attaching a brief transcript from the recordings, only 2 paragraphs, nothing revealing beyond tone and context. I'd like help determining whether this environment qualifies as harmful or coercive, I wrote. The phrasing felt clinical, steady. I reviewed the message twice before sending it, ensuring the language stayed neutral and factual. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a moment before the email slid into the outbox. Once it was gone, the silence in the room felt different. Not lighter, just clearer. The recorder's small light blinked near the corner of my desk, steady as always. I sat still for a moment, exhaling slowly, letting the decision settle into a quiet corner of my mind. Over the following days, I avoided shared spaces whenever possible. Meals became something I prepared quietly and brought upstairs. My mother glanced at the dishes in the sink with suspicion, but I ignored the unspoken invitation to engage. I wasn't hiding. I was reducing contact. Each step up the staircase felt deliberate, measured. Another small shift in the pattern I'd lived with for so long. In my room, I typed out short summaries of each day's interactions, noting how often I chose silence over reaction. The act of documenting felt like forming a boundary in writing, one that didn't need anyone's approval. The house creaked occasionally, wood settling under the weight of time. But the sound no longer startled me. The distance was intentional. Still, there were moments when the emotional weight of it all pressed against my ribs. Using the law, even as a vocabulary, against my own parents felt like a quiet grief. I wrote one line in my journal that evening. It hurts to name things accurately. The sentence sat alone on the page, surrounded by empty lines. I didn't add more. I closed the notebook and rested my hand over its cover for a few seconds, grounding myself in the decision I'd already made. Downstairs, a cupboard door shut with a dull thud, heavy enough to carry through the air vents. I didn't react. I let the sound pass through me, uncollected, like water sliding down a window pane. Near midnight, I noticed a faint draft coming through the gap beneath my door. The hallway bulb must have flickered earlier. Its low hum drifted lightly into the room. On my desk, the recorder glowed steadily, capturing the layered quiet of the house settling into nighttime. I rearranged a stack of papers, straightening their edges, then set the recorder to charge for the next day. The soft red light felt like a small promise, consistency, in a place where conversations shifted without warning. I turned off my lamp and lay down, letting the room dissolve into darkness. Nothing dramatic had happened that night, and that was its own kind of calm. The confrontation arrived quietly, the way a crack forms in a wall long before anyone notices it spreading. It was close to midnight when my mother called up the stairs, asking me to run to the store for a few things she forgot. The list was vague, unnecessary, and urgent only in the way someone insists on testing whether you will bend. I stepped out of my room, hands steady on the railing. "I don't run errands after 9, I said. No anger, no hesitation. Just a boundary spoken out loud. Her face tightened, eyes narrowing in the low hallway light. The house felt smaller in that moment, the air heavier. My father appeared behind her, expression expectant, as if waiting for the version of me who used to say yes without pause. But that version wasn't there anymore. I kept my breathing even, letting the silence become part of the answer. My mother raised her voice first, a sharp spike in the stillness. "You're staying here for free. The least you can do is help." The words echoed against the narrow stairwell. My father nodded along, arms crossed, reinforcing the accusation with body language more than words. I stood 2 steps above them, physically higher but emotionally level. Their frustration rolled toward me like heat from an open oven, but I didn't move. My arms stayed at my sides, fingers relaxed, shoulders steady. I didn't defend myself. I didn't apologize. I let their words pass through the air between us without absorbing them. The space felt fragile, stretched thin by expectation, but I didn't step into it. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which script would play out next. When their voices rose again, overlapping in a practiced rhythm of grievances, I cut through the noise with a calm I didn't know I could summon. "We can talk when everyone is calm," I said. My tone wasn't stern, it was flat, as controlled as a line drawn with a ruler. Their expressions shifted, momentarily thrown off by the lack of chaos to push against. I stepped back, turning toward my door with deliberate slowness. "Not like this," I added, not raising my voice above theirs. The words landed with a soft finality, the kind that doesn't invite continuation. I felt their anger reach for me, looking for a foothold. But my refusal to argue gave it nothing to cling to. I walked away, each step measured. The door closed with a soft click behind me. Inside my room, I opened my laptop and typed a brief summary of what had happened. No adjectives, no interpretations, just time, location, statements made. I added the file to the folder with the rest, its name fitting neatly into the sequence. Then I uploaded the audio clip from the recorder. 15 minutes of overlapping voices and sharp, uneven intonations. The waveform filled the screen in jagged lines that mirrored the emotional spikes downstairs. I attached a small transcript beneath it, just enough to give context. As I saved the files, my heartbeat steadied. The glow from the laptop screen cast a pale, rectangular pool of light across the desk, making the rest of the room feel distant and quiet, like a separate world I controlled. When I finally sat back, the weight of the moment settled in. Not fear, but affirmation. This wasn't about being right or proving anything. It was about choosing safety over pattern, clarity over chaos. I whispered a sentence to myself, barely audible. I ended it before it escalated. The truth of it grounded me. Someone once told me that self-respect often feels like disobedience in the wrong environment. Tonight, I understood that clearly. Downstairs, I heard a drawer slam, followed by muffled complaints, but none of it reached me the way it used to. I stayed still, letting the quiet of the room wrap around me like a thin, steady shield. I placed my keys on the desk gently, the metal touching wood with a soft, final sound. My hand stayed still for a moment, palms flat, breath even. Outside the window, a car passed slowly, headlights cutting across the ceiling in a brief, pale sweep. The recorder blinked faintly beside the stack of papers, capturing the rest of the night without needing my attention. I turned off the lamp, allowing the room to fall into darkness piece by piece.
There was no victory here, no satisfaction, just a shift, subtle but irreversible. I lay down, listening to the quiet settle into place, the kind that follows a decision made firmly and without regret. A few days after the confrontation, I received an email confirming a part-time job offer. Modest hours, modest pay, but consistent enough to form the first stable rung of a ladder I hadn't touched in months. I printed the schedule and pinned it inside my notebook, smoothing the edges with my thumb. The room felt a shade lighter as I read through the start date. Income meant options. Options meant movement. I breathed slowly, letting the truth settle. I wasn't trapped. I walked to the window and opened it a few inches, letting the late afternoon air drift in, cool and steady. The sound of distant traffic mixed with the faint hum of the house behind me. For the first time in a long while, my next step wasn't a reaction. It was a plan. During lunch break the following day, I sat in the corner of a quiet cafe, scrolling through listings for small rentals. Most were out of range, but a few had potential if I budgeted carefully. I created a shortlist, 2 basement studios and a small upstairs room in an older home. I sent polite, concise messages to the landlords, asking about availability and noise levels. Then I saved their replies into a new folder on my phone. The images, simple rooms with bare walls and thin curtains, felt strangely comforting. They looked like places where voices wouldn't rise without warning. Opportunity didn't need to be glamorous. It just needed to be steady. Back home, I bought a small stack of cardboard boxes from the store and slid them under my bed. They fit neatly in the narrow space, unseen unless someone crouched down to look. I didn't start packing. I simply prepared for packing. The quiet readiness of it steadied me. I opened my closet and mentally separated what would come with me from what would stay. Clothes, notebooks, a few childhood items that felt necessary not for memory, but for continuity. The air in the room smelled faintly of fabric softener and old pine wood. I sat on the floor for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of my parents moving around downstairs. Nothing about the moment felt rushed. It felt practical. That night, I set a reminder on my phone, 30 days notice. The phrase felt almost ceremonial, like a small ribbon placed around the future. Even though no lease existed, I wanted to hold myself to a standard of fairness. Order mattered, even if the house I lived in didn't value it. I wrote the date on a sticky note and placed it near my laptop screen. The quiet glow of the monitor illuminated the handwriting, making it look sharper, more certain. In the corner of the room, a soft draft slipped through the vents, carrying the faint aroma of dinner long finished. I closed the curtains gently, signaling to myself that the day's decisions were complete. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the idea settle. Leaving wasn't escaping, it was choosing. I pressed my palms together, resting them against my forehead, for a slow breath. The heaviness I'd been carrying for weeks shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the possibility of release. I whispered the truth quietly into the room. This isn't running away. The words didn't echo, they absorbed into the stillness. Downstairs, a chair scraped softly against the tile, followed by the murmur of voices. I didn't strain to hear the words. Their conversations no longer dictated my pulse. The distance between us, once raw, now felt necessary. Later,
when the house settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. I lay back and listened to the even hum of the air conditioner. The sound was steady, predictable, comforting in its neutrality. I held my phone loosely in my hand, scrolling through the rental photos once more. A small window here, a narrow kitchenette there. Nothing extravagant.
But the idea of a door that opened only when I chose to open it felt like luxury. I set the phone aside and turned off the lamp. The darkness settled smoothly, unthreatening. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the start of an outline. One I was ready to follow, step by careful step. The shift showed itself in small questions that carried more weight than they seemed to. "What time will you be home tonight?" my father asked as I slipped on my shoes for work. His tone was calm, but the implication landed clean. He wanted oversight, not information. I took a slow breath, tying the laces with deliberate patience. "My schedule is private," I said, my voice steady and pared down to its simplest form. His eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised by the clarity rather than the content. I didn't fill the silence with softening words. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and stepped past him with measured calm. The hall light flickered once above us, a quick pulse before returning to a steady glow. I walked out the door without waiting for a reaction, letting the cool air outside settle over my skin like a reset button. That afternoon after work, I taped a small note on my bedroom door. "Please knock before entering." The handwriting was simple, the paper unadorned. I pressed the edges firmly against the wood, feeling the slight texture catch beneath my fingers. When my mother passed by, she paused, stared at the note for a moment, then kept walking without comment. The silence said more than an argument would have. I sat on my bed afterward, listening to the faint echo of her footsteps fade down the hallway. Boundaries didn't need approval, they just needed to exist. The paper fluttered slightly when the vent clicked on, the soft movement reminding me that I had claimed something small but significant. Privacy without apology. I moved the recorder closer to the shared hallway, placing it on a shelf beside an old stack of paperbacks. It blended in naturally, its small blinking light barely visible unless someone looked closely. From that position, it captured the ambient rhythm of the house. Footsteps, doors opening, the cadence of conversations carried on as if I weren't meant to hear them. The device didn't care about intention or tone. It simply gathered what happened. While I rearranged the books to hide the cords, I felt a strange sense of order settle over me. Not power, just clarity. The kind that comes from knowing that reality was being preserved somewhere concrete, no matter how fast the spoken version might shift. Later that evening, I sent the legal clinic the first small bundle of evidence. They didn't need the full archive yet, just samples for context. The email was short, almost minimalist. Attached are recordings demonstrating ongoing verbal hostility and boundary violations. Please confirm receipt. I attached 3 files, each under 5 minutes. 1 heated exchange, 1 pattern of demands, 1 instance of intrusion. I clicked send and leaned back, letting the tension in my shoulders release by degrees. A few minutes later, their auto-response arrived. "Received. We will review." That was enough for now. I closed my laptop gently and rested my hands on the cool surface, the silence of the room settling with deliberate softness around me. For the first time in weeks, I understood my own motivation with perfect clarity. I wasn't trying to win anything. I wasn't trying to shame them or expose them. I just wanted safety and respect, 2 things that had quietly eroded long before I moved back in. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting that truth rest on my tongue like a sentence finally spoken after years of silence. The air felt different, cooler, almost breathable. Somewhere downstairs, the dishwasher hummed in its final cycle, a predictable mechanical sound that steadied me. I didn't need harmony. I needed accuracy. And accuracy required distance. When I stepped into the hallway to turn off the upstairs light, the bulb flickered rapidly twice.
sharp, quick flashes that cast thin shadows across the walls. I paused, letting my eyes adjust. The rest of the house remained still. I reached for the switch, flipped it down, and stood in the dimness for a heartbeat before returning to my room. On my desk, the recorder continued its quiet, consistent pulse, and I felt my breath align with its steadiness. I didn't feel triumphant or afraid. I simply felt ready. Ready for whatever the next step demanded. Ready to stand where I needed to stand, even if no one else agreed. I returned home early one afternoon to grab a document for work, and the moment I entered my room, something felt off. The air held a faint, unsettled stillness. My notebook on the desk had shifted slightly, its corner no longer aligned with the edge the way I always kept it. A drawer was half an inch open, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be wrong. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes scan the space slowly, trained not to jump to conclusions. Then I noticed that the small pouch I kept for receipts had been moved from the right side of the drawer to the left. No one else had permission to be in this room. I took out my phone and photographed each angle, before touching anything, before straightening a single object. The evidence wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and that was enough. That evening, I installed a small door chime on the inside of my bedroom door. A simple adhesive-backed device that rang a soft tone when opened. It wasn't loud or confrontational, just a signal, a line of sound marking when someone entered my space. I didn't hide it. I placed it plainly beside the frame. When my mother walked by, she paused at the sight of it, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "What's that for?" she asked. "Notification," I answered simply. No accusation, no explanation. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again, walking away. I tested the chime once. A gentle ring echoed across the quiet room. The sound felt small, but meaningful, like a lock on a diary no one should have read. Later, I wrote a brief email to both of them, respectful in tone, concise in content. "Please refrain from entering my room without permission. My personal belongings were moved today. I need my space to remain private." I added the timestamp of when I noticed the disturbance. I kept the language neutral, stripping it of emotion. When I hit send, the air felt tighter, as if the walls themselves were bracing for a response. Minutes later, my father replied, "This is our house, our rules." I took a screenshot immediately, saving it in a new folder. The phrasing was familiar, authoritative, dismissive, final. But I didn't absorb it the way I used to. I saved the file, closed my laptop, and let the sentence sit where it belonged, in the archive, not in my chest. The tension rose in the hours that followed. My mother knocked once, not waiting for an answer, then opened the door and said, "You're being dramatic. No one cares about your little things." I kept my body still, sitting at my desk with my hands resting on the armrests. "Please knock and wait before entering," I said, staying level. She huffed, rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath, and left. I didn't react, not to her tone, not to the dismissal. I simply wrote the event down after she closed the door. Facts, time, behavior. The house creaked softly, a long wooden stretch that echoed her mood more than mine. I finished my notes and returned to the email thread, rereading my own message to confirm my clarity. I had been respectful, direct, balanced. That was what mattered. That night, as I sat in bed reviewing the files, I felt a steadying truth settle in my chest. Privacy wasn't a request, it was a right. I realized how long I had accepted blurred boundaries as normal, believing that closeness excused intrusion. It didn't. I wrote a short sentence in my journal. "My space is mine to define." The words looked almost too simple on the page, but they held weight. Downstairs I could hear faint conversation, my parents' voices low, clipped, irritated. I didn't strain to catch the details. Their frustration wasn't data I needed. My pulse stayed steady, my breath even. For the first time, I felt the house's noise pass through me without tightening anything inside. Before sleeping, I packed the first small box. Books, a few documents, nothing sentimental. The cardboard scraped lightly against the carpet as I slid it to the corner of the room. The chime on the door rang once when I tested it again. A soft tone that felt like a gentle line drawn around my personal world. The recorder blinked steadily from its spot on the shelf, capturing the quiet, the movements, the subtle shifts in air. I turned off the light and lay still, feeling the firmness of my decision settle deeper. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for departure, and that difference changed everything. The legal clinic called on a Tuesday morning, their number appearing on my screen in an unfamiliar area code. I stepped into my room, closed the door gently, and answered. The counselor's voice was calm, practiced, each word chosen with precision. We went through the checklist together: verbal hostility, inconsistent demands, privacy violations, emotional escalation, control disguised as rules. When I described the most recent incident, entering my room without permission, there was a short pause, then a quiet confirmation. This qualifies as a harmful environment. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed lightly to my ear, allowing the statement to land. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt like someone had turned a blurry shape into a clear line. When the call ended, I stared at the muted sunlight hitting the wall, the room carrying a strange mixture of heaviness and relief. The clinic's recommendation was simple: leave without offering payment. You're not obligated to pay rent retroactively, they said. If there is pushback, respond with your documentation. Do not engage emotionally. I wrote down every instruction in a small notebook, the pen gliding steadily as though it already knew the path forward. When I closed the cover, I felt my shoulders drop an inch, tension shifting from my body into the page. I walked to the window and opened it wider, letting fresh air sweep across the room. The scent of damp earth drifted in from the yard below. I watched a thin cloud move across the sky, slow and unhurried. For the first time, leaving didn't feel like conflict. It felt like procedure. That evening, I drafted the message I would eventually send. A formal notice of departure, polite but firm. I will be moving out on date. I will return the key directly. Thank you. No explanation, no apology, no justification. Just a clean, factual line. I practiced reading it aloud until the tone felt even, steady. Then I placed the printed copy inside an envelope and left it on my desk, untouched. The lamp cast a pale glow over the paper, softening its edges. I didn't send it yet. I wanted to move deliberately, not impulsively. I folded laundry, stacked the rest of my documents, and reset the room into quiet order. Each movement felt like part of a transition ritual, removing noise, making space for what came next. Before bed, I opened my banking app and transferred a small portion of my paycheck into a savings account I'd labeled Exit. The number wasn't large, but it was enough to create a cushion. I canceled a subscription I didn't need and double-checked that none of my accounts were connected to the household. Every step was clean, measured, almost soothing. I placed my cards back into my wallet, aligning them neatly in their slots. The quiet financial independence gave me a sense of stability I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The room felt slightly brighter, even with the lights dimmed. I leaned back in my chair and breathed out, long and controlled, letting the day settle into its final shape. The emotional shift came late, unexpected and soft. I sat at the foot of my bed and realized I wasn't afraid. Not of leaving, not of confrontation, not of what they might say. I felt something closer to clarity, almost like the moment a fog lifts from a familiar street. I whispered to myself, "This is the right direction." The words felt grounded, not dramatic. I didn't need permission to feel them. Downstairs, the low murmur of conversation drifted upward, muted by walls and distance. I didn't move toward the sound. I didn't tense. I let it be background noise, irrelevant to the decision I had already made. The hallway outside my room was still, carrying only the faint hum of the upstairs vent. On my way back from the bathroom, I noticed a sealed envelope lying slightly crooked on the hallway carpet. Thin, pale, edges soft from handling. It must have fallen from the stack of mail someone carried earlier. The sight of it caught my breath for half a second, not because of what it contained, but because of what it symbolized. Something waiting to be delivered, carried from one place to another. I didn't touch it. I simply stepped around it and walked into my room. The quiet behind the door felt absolute, like the beginning of a final chapter I was finally ready to write. I began moving my personal belongings 2 days before giving notice. Not all at once, quietly, in small trips that didn't alter the shape of the room enough for anyone to notice. A friend offered her trunk, and we loaded 2 boxes on a weekday afternoon when the house was still and empty. The sun slanted across the driveway in long, pale beams, warming the cardboard against my palms. I didn't rush. Each item I carried felt like a step toward reclaiming something I'd lost without realizing it. When we closed the trunk, the soft thud sounded final in a way that didn't frighten me. My room upstairs looked almost unchanged, bed made, books aligned, desk still functional. But beneath the surface, the separation was already in motion, quiet, organized, irreversible. The following evening I cleaned my room meticulously, wiping down the window frames, folding the blankets, aligning the desk chair. I found a small notepad on my shelf and tore out one sheet. On it, I wrote 2 simple words: "Thank you." Nothing more, nothing less. I placed the note on the dresser where it would be seen but not mistaken as an invitation to debate. I didn't write anything emotional or explanatory. Closure didn't need elaboration. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes take in the space I had occupied, not with nostalgia, but with a calm sense of completion. The room smelled faintly of lavender detergent from the freshly washed sheets, a gentleness that contrasted with everything that had happened here. My parents didn't notice anything until the next morning, when I came downstairs with my keys in hand. "You still owe for this month," my father said, not looking up from the newspaper. His voice carried the same weight as always, a mixture of authority and expectation. I held my breath for a quiet second before responding. There was no agreement for payment. My mother set down her cup with a sharp clink. "Don't start that again." I didn't. I kept my expression steady. "If you have questions, the documentation explains everything." The sentence hung in the air, firm without heat. Their faces tightened, confusion mixing with resistance. I didn't elaborate. Clarity was already written in files they hadn't seen. I returned the key at noon, placing it gently on the dining table. The metal clicked softly against the wood. My father looked at it as if it were an unexpected object, rather than something I had used every day. My mother asked, "You're really leaving?" Not with softness, but with disbelief. "Yes," I answered. No tremor, no apology. I handed them a printed form, a simple move-out acknowledgement, 2 lines and a date. Neither reached for it immediately. I placed it beside the key and stepped back. The air felt thick, but my breathing stayed even. I didn't wait for signatures. I simply informed them where the rest of my boxes were and walked toward the door with measured calm. The final moment surprised me with its gentleness. As I stepped outside, I realized I felt no sharp pain, no guilt tearing at the edges, only a softened ache that was easy to carry. Leaving didn't erase anything. It didn't fix anything. It simply honored what could no longer be repaired from inside the same walls. I whispered quietly, to myself, not to them. "I'm done trying to earn a seat at the table." The words were soft, steady, truer than I expected. I walked down the steps, feeling the cool air skim across my arms, and didn't look back. The house behind me made no sound. That night, I lay on the floor of my new rental, a thin mattress beside me, half-assembled furniture waiting in silent corners. The scent of fresh paint lingered lightly in the air. I opened the small window above the bed, allowing a breeze to drift in, carrying the unfamiliar sounds of a new street. It was quiet, peaceful, even. I placed my phone beside me and checked the door lock twice, not out of fear, but out of habit. Then I rested the first box of books at my side and used it as a pillow. The floor was firm, grounding. I exhaled, long and slow. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for anything. The room didn't demand anything from me, and that was enough. The messages began 2 days after I settled into the new rental. I was eating a simple dinner, rice, sautéed vegetables, when my phone buzzed. "You owe 3 months of rent," the text read, sent from my mother's number. I stared at the sentence, not out of shock but out of recognition. This was the pattern I had anticipated. Escalation after distance, pressure disguised as obligation. I placed the fork down carefully, wiped my fingers on a napkin, and took a screenshot. Then another message arrived, this one sharper. "We were generous, don't take advantage." I saved it too, labeling the files quietly. The room around me remained still, untouched by their tone. My new walls didn't echo their urgency. The quiet in the rental felt like a buffer I hadn't known I needed. I drafted a response, using the clinic's recommended template. There was no rental agreement. The environment contained consistent hostility and boundary violations. I declined further demands. I kept the wording neutral, concise. After reading it twice, I pressed send. There was no surge of adrenaline, no tremor in my hands. It felt like signing off on a form at the DMV, routine, procedural, emotionless. Minutes later, I received a long message filled with layered accusations, ungratefulness, irresponsibility, betrayal. I didn't reply. I didn't even finish reading it. I took a screenshot, archived it, and set my phone face down. The rental's small lamp glowed warmly beside me, illuminating only the pages of the book I'd opened earlier, not the past. Pulling at the edges of my calm. The next morning brought another wave of messages, this time from extended relatives. "Your parents are worried. Why are you causing trouble? Just pay something, so everyone can move on." The phrasing was almost identical, as if coordinated. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I typed one sentence to each. "Please communicate via written messages only. Copy, paste, send." I saved each conversation as a separate PDF and filed them neatly into my digital folder. The act felt mechanical, the way one might stack documents before a meeting. I wasn't shaken by their tone. Pressure worked only when I absorbed it. Today, I didn't absorb anything. I breathed evenly, the air in my new room cool and steady along my skin. At lunch, I prepared a brief summary for the mediator the clinic had connected me with, just in case the situation escalated. Timeline of requests. Summary of documented behavior. Recent financial demands. The lines formed a quiet but firm narrative. I emailed it with a short sentence. Prepared if needed. Then I closed the laptop and washed my dishes, letting warm water run across my fingers in a slow, grounding rhythm. Nothing dramatic had happened, but the clarity of my actions created an internal order I hadn't felt in years. The silence of the rental was different from silence at home. It wasn't tension waiting to break. It was simply quiet. I refused to let this conflict reshape how I carried myself. That evening, I reminded myself of one rule I had chosen long before leaving. Do not retaliate. I wasn't here to win. I was here to protect my peace. I didn't post anything online. I didn't vent to friends. I didn't replay conversations in my mind. I simply noted the facts and released them. When I sat on the edge of my new bed, I realized that anger wasn't necessary for boundaries to stand. Neutrality was enough. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner from the wipe down I'd done earlier. Everything felt deliberate, Minimal. Calm. Before sleeping, I practiced the breathing pattern I'd used during the hardest days at home. 4 seconds in, 7 seconds hold, 8 seconds out. My pulse slowed, settling into a rhythm that felt almost like gratitude. I glanced at the single box left unemptied in the corner, the one holding the last remnants of my old life. I didn't feel rushed to open it. It could wait. The night outside was quiet, a gentle breeze brushing against the window. I reached over and turned off the lamp. Darkness settled in cleanly, without the tension that used to hover in the corners of my old room. I closed my eyes, steady, unburdened, and ready for whatever came next.
Rain arrived late that night at my new rental, a steady drizzle tapping against the hallway bulb that flickered briefly before dimming again. I watched the soft glow shift along the floorboards as I stood in the doorway, listening to the gentle patter outside. The weather made everything feel slower, quieter, like the world had stepped back to give me space to breathe. I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth and let my thoughts settle. The tension from the messages, the accusations, the pressure. They all felt distant in the presence of rain. I stood still until the bulb steadied, the faint hum returning to its usual rhythm. Nothing demanded my reaction tonight. The room, the rain, and the dim light agreed on one thing. I had earned this stillness. Later, while sorting through a box I had left untouched, I found an old audio file on my phone, a clip of my mother laughing during a holiday dinner years ago. The sound was warm, full, unguarded. For a moment, it pulled at something in my chest I had been carefully keeping at a distance. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to it once, then again. The contrast between then and now was sharp, but not surprising. I realized slowly that I no longer wished for that version of us to return. Not because I didn't value it, but because it no longer defined who we were. I closed the file gently and set the phone aside. Grief didn't need to be loud to be real. That same night, I opened a new document on my laptop and titled it, Why Limuation. Beneath it, I wrote 5 short bullet points, clear, precise, unembellished. Boundary violations, verbal hostility, emotional pressure, lack of privacy, unpredictable demands. Seeing the reasons laid out so simply made them undeniable, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just factual. I saved the file and placed it in the root folder, somewhere easy to find on the days when doubt tried to take shape. When I closed the laptop, I felt an unexpected lightness,
As if listing the reasons had quietly anchored me deeper into my own decision. The wind outside tapped against the glass once before moving on. My phone buzzed again that evening, new messages from the extended family group chat. Instead of spiraling, I muted the thread for 48 hours. 2 taps on the screen, nothing more. The silence that followed felt clean, uncluttered. I placed the phone face down and let it rest on the blanket beside me. My breathing slowed, matching the calm rhythm of the rain outside. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel compelled to explain myself to anyone. I didn't owe responses to conversations designed to pull me back into old scripts. Tonight, choosing distance was not an escape. It was self-respect. Before bed, I sat on the floor and folded the last remaining blanket from the move. The simple act grounded me. Cotton edges aligned, corners squared, breathing steady. Folding something without rush reminded me that not every moment needed to carry emotional weight. Some tasks were just tasks, and tasks could be gentle. I placed the folded blanket on the shelf with deliberate calm. The room felt organized, almost tender in its orderliness. I sat for a moment longer, letting my spine relax into the quiet, observing the stillness rather than filling it. As I turned off the lights for the night, the room settled into a soft darkness that didn't hold tension in its corners. The rain softened to a whisper outside, brushing against the thin window pane. I crawled into bed and pulled the blanket up to my shoulders, feeling the last bit of cool air disappear beneath it. There was a small ache in my chest, memory, not regret, and I let it sit without trying to change it. Healing wasn't supposed to feel triumphant. Sometimes it felt like this: quiet, steady, and just light enough to carry into tomorrow. The next call from my parents came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was slicing fruit in my small kitchen when the phone vibrated against the counter. My father's voice was flat, almost rehearsed. "If you pay half, we'll forget the rest," he said, as if offering a peace treaty. I steadied the knife on the cutting board and breathed once through my nose before answering. "I don't have any obligation to pay," I said. No rise in tone, no defensiveness, just fact. He exhaled sharply, the sound carrying irritation more than disappointment. I let the silence hold. "We're trying to be reasonable," he added. I didn't reply. Reason had never looked like this between us. I ended the call with a polite, "Take care," then set the phone down gently, as if handling something fragile. Minutes later, I opened my laptop and drafted a one-page summary of events. The same timeline I had organized weeks earlier, but now condensed into a clean overview. Dates of demands, examples of intrusions, brief descriptions of verbal hostility. I attached the 3 clearest audio clips and included the text messages about supposed rent. The file was precise, factual, stripped of emotion. I sent it to the mediator with a short line. Updated summary, no further contact expected until resolution. The cursor blinked for a moment before the message slipped away. I leaned back, feeling my spine settle into the chair. Evidence wasn't heavy, it was orderly, and order had become its own form of calm. When my father called back, his tone had softened into something ambiguous, half apology, half negotiation. "Let's just sort this out quietly," he said. I kept my phone at a small distance and listened without interrupting. "We didn't mean for things to go this far," he continued, voice dipping into an unfamiliar softness. I could feel the old reflex rising, the urge to reassure, to smooth the tension, to offer emotional cushioning. Instead, I held the line. "If there's anything to discuss," I said, "please put it in writing." The sentence was simple, but it drew a clean, invisible boundary between us. He hesitated, then muttered something indistinct before ending the call. When the screen went dark, I let my shoulders lower, inch by inch. My mother tried next. Her voice was wrapped in a thin layer of warmth, the kind that used to pull me into compliance. "We just want to fix things," she said. "Maybe we misunderstood." The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed. I kept my tone steady. "If there's something specific you'd like to address, please write it down." She sighed, frustrated by my insistence on structure. "Why are you being so formal?" she asked. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the question pass through me. Formality wasn't distance, it was safety. "It keeps things clear," I answered. She didn't respond. The silence that followed felt less like tension and more like a door quietly closing between 2 rooms. I wrote a short note to myself later that evening. Clarity protects both sides. I set the pen down and let the words settle. I wasn't angry. I wasn't resentful. I didn't want them punished or humiliated. What I wanted was simple. No more manipulation disguised as concern. No more shifting rules. No more emotional debt. I read through my written boundaries once more before closing the notebook. Outside, the sun dipped behind the buildings, the sky turning a muted shade of violet.
The air in my rental felt steady, carrying none of the sharp edges I had grown used to. I rested my palms on the desk and let the quiet anchor me. Just before heading to dinner with a friend, I turned off the ringer on my phone. The small gesture felt like a final adjustment, a way of signaling to myself that I wasn't available for old patterns anymore. I slipped the phone into my bag, grabbed my keys, and locked the door behind me with a clean click. The hallway smelled faintly of someone's cooking, warm and inviting. As I walked down the stairs, my steps felt unhurried, grounded. I didn't check my phone once. Whatever message came next, if any, could wait until I was ready. And for the first time in a long time, the timing belonged entirely to me. The mediation took place in a small conference room with frosted windows and chairs that felt intentionally neutral. No comfort, no hostility. I arrived 10 minutes early, settling my folder on the table and breathing evenly while the clock ticked softly above the door. When my parents walked in, they avoided my eyes at first. My mother sat down with a stiff posture, hands folded tightly in her lap. My father placed his phone face down, a gesture that tried to appear casual but carried tension beneath it. The mediator began with a calm explanation of the process. I kept my gaze on the table, not out of avoidance but to stay centered. My folder remained closed until it was needed. The air felt dense but not threatening, just two histories and a boundary line waiting to be drawn cleanly. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't recount feelings or interpretations. I listed events in chronological order, each one anchored by dates and concise descriptions. The mediator nodded slowly, occasionally jotting down notes. My mother's expression flickered between indignation and discomfort, and my father shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. When the audio clips played, short, trimmed, factual, neither of them spoke. The room absorbed their silence. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. This wasn't about blame. It was about accuracy. The mediator asked a few clarifying questions, which I answered with the same steady tone I had practiced for weeks. When the playback ended, the quiet felt heavier, as if the walls themselves acknowledged the truth laid out plainly. My proposal was simple. No retroactive rent, no future demands, no pressure-driven communication. I'm willing to keep things respectful and limited, I said, but I need the pressure to stop. The mediator repeated my words in a balanced tone,
as if setting them on the table for examination. My father looked down, rubbing his thumb along the edge of his phone. My mother pressed her lips together, a frown forming, not from anger but from the discomfort of hearing boundaries spoken aloud. "We didn't realize it felt that way," she said, her voice quieter than usual. The mediator nodded, acknowledging the statement without giving it weight beyond what it was. A beginning, not a resolution. I kept my breathing steady, in and out, using the chair as firm back to ground myself. The discussion shifted toward possible next steps. My parents wanted some understanding to preserve their dignity. I listened without interrupting. The mediator suggested language that allowed both sides to step away without escalating further. "You may agree not to pursue financial matters," he said, "and also not to publicly share personal information." That was reasonable. I nodded once. "I'm fine with that," I said. My mother exhaled in relief, though her expression still held a hint of unease. My father finally looked at me, not with affection, but with something close to acknowledgement. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition of a line drawn they could no longer ignore. As the session drew toward its end, I noticed something unexpected. The absence of anger inside me. No shaking hands, no rising heat, no instinct to argue. I felt composed, almost clinical, as if the structure of the conversation had allowed my emotions to settle into a precise shape. The mediator asked each of us to confirm our agreement. My parents murmured their assent. I responded clearly. I agree to the terms as stated. The words left my lips evenly, steady as a measured pulse. The room felt lighter after that, though none of us moved right away. It was as if all three of us needed a moment to adjust to the new arrangement, one shaped by boundaries rather than emotional currency. When it was over, I signed the mediator's summary document, my pen gliding across the paper without hesitation. My parents signed next, their signatures slower but resolute. I slipped my copy into my folder and stood. There was no hug, no dramatic exit, just a quiet nod exchanged between people who had finally stopped pretending the old patterns worked. I left the room first, stepping into the hallway where the lighting was softer and the air felt clearer. As the door clicked shut behind me, I felt something settle inside my chest. Not triumph, not sorrow, but a grounded certainty. I had protected my peace, and now, finally, the process could move forward. The final agreement arrived by email 2 days after the mediation. The subject line was plain, summary of terms, but seeing it made my breath settle in a way I hadn't expected. I sat at my small kitchen table, the morning light falling across the screen in a thin, diagonal strip. As I opened the attached PDF, each clause appeared exactly as stated in the session. No pursuit of past rent, no financial obligations moving forward, no pressure-based communication. The language was concise and unemotional, the kind of clarity I'd been craving for months. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words take their full shape. This wasn't victory. It wasn't vindication. It was simply the clean end of a chapter that had frayed for too long. The room felt quietly aligned with my breathing. I printed 2 copies, one for my records, one for a sealed file. The printer hummed steadily, each page sliding out with a gentle rustle. I punched holes into the top copy and placed it into a binder I had prepared the night before, labeling the spine with the date. The second copy I slipped into a clear sleeve, pressing out the air bubbles until the surface lay flat. Filing these pages didn't feel bureaucratic. It felt grounding. The documentation wasn't a shield anymore. It was a marker in time, a clear line between what came before and what would come next. I set the binder on the highest shelf, out of sight but not out of reach, then closed the cabinet with a quiet click. I sent a short message to my parents. Thank you for completing the agreement. No embellishment, no invitation to reopen anything. The sentence stood clean on its own. A few minutes later, my mother responded with a single word, "Okay," followed by nothing else. My father didn't reply. The absence of hostility felt almost unfamiliar, like walking through a room where furniture had been rearranged overnight. I stared at the screen for a moment, not with sadness or longing, but with a neutral acknowledgement of what remained between us. Distance, structure, and a thin thread of civility. That was enough. Maybe the only amount that could exist without collapsing under old habits. Later that afternoon, I cleared a small corner of my rental and set up a workspace I hadn't made time for before. A simple desk, a lamp with warm light, a notebook, and a clean mug for tea. I arranged each object deliberately, letting the room settle into its new configuration. When I sat down, I realized how much of my energy had been tied to monitoring chaos, responding to tone shifts, bracing for impact. Without those demands pressing in, the silence felt expansive. I brewed a cup of tea and watched the steam rise in a thin ribbon. The simplicity of the moment felt almost like a recalibration, my body learning a different baseline. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the neighboring building, I felt a small shift inside, an internal rearranging that pulled my thoughts into alignment. The past no longer felt like an open case. It felt concluded, documented, filed. I didn't feel relieved exactly, but I felt steady. I sat on the edge of my bed, letting the room's fading light settle across my legs. In the quiet, I recognized an unfamiliar emotion slowly emerging. Trust. Not in them, but in myself. My ability to act, to protect, to choose. It was soft, subtle, not triumphant, but undeniably present. I let it sit in my chest like a new tenant. Before sleeping, I placed the recorder, the one that had followed me through every shift, into a small box at the top of my closet. Not as evidence, not as a weapon, but as something that had served its purpose. I closed the lid gently and slid it into its corner. Then I turned off the lights, letting the room fall into darkness without resistance. The air felt cool and even, the night outside calm. As I lay down, I felt the unfamiliar but welcome sensation of nothing being demanded from me. No vigilance, no defense. Just the quiet of a room that finally belonged entirely to me. The call came a week later, unexpected and quiet. I was wiping down my small kitchen counter when my phone vibrated with my mother's number. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, but something urged me to answer, with boundaries, not fear. Her voice was softer than usual, carrying an uncertainty I hadn't heard in a long time. "I wanted to check if you're doing okay," she said. The words felt unfinished, as if she didn't know where to place the rest. I leaned against the counter, letting the cool surface meet my spine. "I'm doing fine," I replied. My tone was even, not distant but measured. There was a faint pause on her end, like she was adjusting to the new shape of our conversations, smaller, cleaner, without emotional leverage. She continued, hesitating over each sentence. "The agreement, we're sticking to it. Your father said it's better this way." I listened, noting the shift in her voice. Not warmth exactly, but a gentleness carved from caution. I didn't fill the silence for her. Silence was not an invitation to return to old patterns. It was a boundary she now had to navigate differently. When she asked, "Can we talk sometimes? Just to talk?" I took a slow breath. The request wasn't unreasonable, but it carried implications. "Only if the conversations stay respectful," I said. The clarity wasn't harsh, it was a requirement. She murmured a quiet, "Okay," like someone reading terms they hadn't expected but were willing to accept. After the call ended, I sat at my small dining table with the phone still in my hand. The conversation hadn't reopened old wounds, nor had it healed anything. It simply acknowledged a space between us, a space defined, not avoided. I opened my notebook and wrote a brief reflection. Respect is the minimum. Silence is allowed. Distance is healthy. The words steadied me. The afternoon light spilled through the window in slow-moving shapes, shifting gently across the tabletop. I let the stillness settle, recognizing that this was the version of connection I could manage. Measured, limited, anchored in clarity rather than emotion. Later, I stepped outside to take out the trash, and the air carried the coolness of early evening. A neighbor nodded hello as she passed with her dog, and I returned the gesture, small, effortless. Walking back up the stairs, I noticed how light my chest felt. Not empty, not guarded, just light. The conflict that had once filled every corner of my mind no longer dictated my breath or my posture. I wasn't waiting for the next spike in tone or the next accusation. The calm wasn't fragile anymore. It had begun to root itself in the routine of my new life. Each quiet moment felt like another piece of ground settling beneath me. Inside, I turned on a warm lamp and made tea, watching the steam curl upward in delicate spirals. I thought briefly about the past, how much energy I had spent deciphering moods, anticipating reactions, absorbing tension that wasn't mine to carry. Now, my energy moved differently. It was directed inward, toward building something sustainable rather than repairing something broken. I sat at my desk, sipping slowly, letting the heat soothe my hands. The room around me held its calm without effort. There was no need to record anything, no need to prepare for escalation. I was learning how quiet could become a foundation, not a waiting room. Before bed, I went through my small nightly routine, closing the blinds, rinsing the mug, checking the door lock once. Each task felt like confirmation that this was my space, my rhythm, my life. When I finally lay down, the dim outline of the room felt steady and familiar. I exhaled into the darkness, letting the day dissolve around me. The phone remained silent on the nightstand, and for the first time, a call from my parents didn't carry threat or weight. It carried choice, and I had learned how to choose myself without apology. 2 weeks later, my father called. The notification flashed on my screen while I was organizing receipts at my desk. I hesitated for a moment, then answered with the same calm I had practiced since leaving. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its usual edge. "I wanted to update you," he said. "We've talked. We're not going to bring up money again." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "Good," I replied. The word was simple, almost weightless. He didn't rush to fill the silence, and that alone felt like progress. For the first time in months, the conversation stayed level. No accusations, no sudden shifts. Just two people speaking from different rooms, different lives, and finally accepting that difference. He continued in a steady tone. "Your mother and we're trying to communicate better." The phrasing was tentative, as if he were testing how it sounded outside of his own head. I let the words sit without challenging them. "That's your work to do," I said. My voice didn't soften to cushion the statement. It didn't harden either. It was simply factual. He exhaled slowly, perhaps absorbing the responsibility he had spent years pretending wasn't his. "We'd like to talk sometimes," he added, echoing my mother's earlier request. "In small amounts," I said, "on calm days." There was a pause, then a quiet agreement on his end. It felt like the first boundary he didn't push against. When the call ended, I stepped outside onto the small balcony attached to my rental. The evening air brushed gently across my arms, carrying the scent of someone grilling in a nearby yard. The ambient noise of distant traffic, children playing, and a dog barking created a background I didn't have to interpret. Nothing in it demanded vigilance. I leaned against the railing, letting my breath settle. Connections didn't have to be cut entirely. They just had to be reshaped. And reshaping wasn't bitterness. It was maturity, the kind I had earned through months of clarity, restraint, and choosing not to react the way the old version of me might have. Back inside, I updated a small personal document I'd been keeping since the mediation, communication patterns post-agreement. I added 2 short lines. Father called : father called calmly, no financial requests. Boundaries restated and accepted. The file wasn't for legal use anymore, it was for me. A quiet log tracking whether the relationship moved in healthier directions or simply cycled back into old patterns. As I typed the final period, I realized I no longer felt the tightness that used to accompany any interaction with them. The documentation had shifted from defense to simple observation, like tracking weather rather than preparing for a storm. That night, I cooked a simple meal, pan-fried tofu, greens, and rice, and ate slowly at the small wooden table I'd bought secondhand. The chair creaked gently beneath me, a familiar sound now woven into my new life. As I ate, I thought about the changes that had happened quietly, almost invisibly. The absence of dread, the freedom to choose silence, the ability to let their moods stay on their side of the line. Healing wasn't dramatic, it was incremental. A series of steady choices layered over time. I washed my dish afterward and let it air dry, the kitchen lit by the soft yellow glow of a single bulb. Before bed, I turned off the balcony light and watched the room fall into darkness. Not abrupt, but gradual, settling into corners with a gentle calm. I lay down and pulled the blanket over myself, feeling its soft weight center me. My phone was on the nightstand, silent. No messages, no demands, no unresolved tension humming beneath the surface. I didn't think about what might come next. I didn't rehearse conversations or anticipate conflict. The quiet wasn't a fragile piece anymore. It was becoming my new baseline, and for the first time, it felt like the middle ground I had built, carefully, deliberately, could actually hold. It was early afternoon when my phone rang again, my mother this time. I had just finished sweeping the small hallway of my rental, the sunlight spilling across the floor like a quiet spill of gold. I answered without rushing. Her voice came through softer than I expected, steady but cautious. "Your father hasn't been feeling well," she said. The statement carried no accusation, no hidden pressure, just information. I leaned a shoulder against the wall, listening. "Is it serious?" I asked. "No," she replied. "Just age catching up with him." In the past, concern would have pulled me back into the old patterns. Panic, guilt, a rushed attempt to fix something I didn't break. But now, the concern was real, the boundaries intact. I breathed evenly and let her speak. She continued, describing doctor visits and medications, her tone threaded with a subtle vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. I didn't interrupt. "We're managing," she said, and the words sounded unexpectedly sincere. I found myself responding gently but firmly. "I'm glad he's okay. Keep me updated. In writing, please." The last line was delivered calmly without emphasis. She didn't protest this time. Instead, she nodded, a soft, barely audible sound. "I will," she said. That small agreement settled something inside me. We weren't slipping back into old dynamics. We were learning a new rhythm. Slow, sparse, structured. After the call, I set the phone down and stood in the quiet hallway, letting the stillness expand around me. There was no spike of anxiety, no emotional residue clinging to my ribs. I had listened without absorbing. I had cared without collapsing. I walked to my desk and made a brief note. Health update. No action required. The sentence looked clean on the page, a reminder that empathy didn't have to equal entanglement. The sunlight shifted slightly across the desk, and I moved my notebook into its warmth. The room felt grounded, like a place where information could land without destabilizing anything. Later that evening, I took a short walk through the neighborhood. The air held a mild chill, the early signs of seasonal change brushing across my arms. A few families sat on their porches, talking in low tones. Nothing about the environment demanded anything from me. My steps were unhurried, matching the quiet cadence of the street. I thought of the call again, not with dread, but with a gentle clarity. I understood now that caring from a distance wasn't coldness, it was health. I didn't have to parent my parents. I didn't have to carry their emotions like unpaid debt. I could simply walk, breathe, and exist without bracing. When I returned home, I boiled water for tea and sat at my small table, watching steam rise in soft spirals. My mind didn't drift to arguments from the past or to anxieties about the future. Instead, it settled on the present. This room, this quiet, this life I had rebuilt one boundary at a time. The call hadn't shaken me. It had revealed how far I'd come. Healing wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the ability to hear news, good or bad, without losing myself. I sipped slowly, letting warmth move through me in steady waves. Before bed, I turned off each light deliberately, one by one, until only the soft glow from the street lamp outside filtered through the blinds. I lay down and felt the gentle weight of the blanket settle over me. The silence was full, not empty, not tense. Full.
My phone rested on the nightstand, quiet. Whatever came next, from them, from life, would arrive on terms I could hold. I wasn't bracing for impact anymore. I was meeting the world from solid ground, steadier than I had ever been. It was a quiet Thursday morning when I realized nothing around me felt provisional anymore. The rental, once a temporary shelter, had become a place that matched the rhythm of my breath. I stood near the window, letting the early light spill across the floor in long, soft strokes. The air felt balanced in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I wasn't waiting for messages or anticipating tension. I wasn't bracing against unseen demands. The silence carried no threat. I made my bed with deliberate motions, smoothing the sheets until the corners were tight. The room felt like an answer to a question I'd spent months learning how to ask. What would my life be like if no one controlled its shape but me? That afternoon, while organizing a drawer I hadn't touched since moving in, I found the small slip of paper I had written weeks ago. The note that simply read, "Why Huyen?" I held it between my fingers, the paper softer now at the edges, worn from movement. The reasons were still true, but they no longer weighed on me. I folded the slip carefully and placed it into an envelope labeled "Past." Not for forgetting, but for context. My past didn't define the room I stood in now. It only explained how I arrived here. I set the envelope in the back of a drawer, where it lived quietly, without demanding space. Later, I called my parents. Not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of a calm curiosity about how they were doing. My father answered. His tone was steady, neutral. "We're fine," he said. No guilt, no pressure. My mother joined the call briefly, offering a small update about the garden blooming early this year. The exchange felt almost like speaking to distant relatives, polite, measured, neither close nor hostile. When the conversation ended, I didn't feel pulled toward them or away from them. I felt parallel, two lives, moving separately but without collision. It was a kind of peace I hadn't known existed. In the early evening, I lit a small candle on my desk, watching its flame hold steady in the quiet air. I opened the notebook I'd filled over the past months, entries documenting confusion, clarity, restraint, and boundary after boundary. I read a few lines, then closed it gently. The notebook had served its purpose. I didn't need to monitor my life anymore. I didn't need evidence or recording or a ledger of interactions. Safety wasn't something I was tracking now. It was something I was living. I slid the notebook into a drawer beside the envelope marked "Past," letting both rest without pressure. For dinner, I cooked slowly, sautéed vegetables, warm rice, a simple broth. Each movement felt unhurried, grounded. As I ate, I thought about the version of myself from the beginning of this story. The one who lived in a house that didn't know how to care for her. Who documented every word to prove she wasn't imagining what she felt. I wished I could reach back to her and place a steady hand on her shoulder. Not to promise an easy road, but to tell her that she wasn't wrong. She wasn't overreacting, and she wasn't alone. She just needed space she hadn't been allowed to claim yet. Before bed, I turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the soft darkness. The room held its own quiet glow, shaped not by bulbs or sunlight, but by the calm I had built inside it. I lay down and let the stillness settle across me like a second blanket. Nothing pressed against my chest.
Nothing tightened around my breath. My life no longer required vigilance. It required presence. And for the first time, presence felt gentle. As sleep drew closer, I realized something simple but profound. The chapter wasn't ending here. It had ended earlier, quietly, the moment I chose myself. This calm room, this steady breath, this was the beginning. In the end, leaving wasn't the climax people expect in stories like this. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument echoing through the hallway. What changed everything was a quiet decision made in a small room I could finally call mine. One where the air didn't shift with someone else's mood, where a closed door actually meant privacy, and where my breath belonged only to me. Healing didn't arrive like a revelation. It arrived in steady routines. Morning light that didn't carry tension. Meals eaten without bracing for a comment. Evenings spent in silence that felt gentle instead of sharp. I learned that peace isn't loud. It's something you build carefully, border by border, until the world inside you finally stops shaking. And though my parents' voices still exist on the periphery of my life, they no longer own the center of it. I keep a respectful distance, a healthier one, shaped by boundaries I no longer apologize for. This is the version of my life I chose deliberately. Quiet, firm, and finally, whole. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, share your experience, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.